The Gladbeck hostage crisis was an incident that took place in Germany in mid-August of 1988, specifically on the 16th to 18th. The young woman you are currently seeing on screen was named Silke Bischoff, and she was 18 years old at the time. Silke had unfortunately been taken hostage by two bank robbers who both had a criminal record. Their names were Hans-Jürgen Rossner and Dieter Degowski. The duo eventually forced their way onto a public bus which carried about 30 passengers, and after reaching their destination, they were all allowed to leave except for two. Several lives would be claimed during this ordeal. The incident began in 1988 on the 16th of August when two armed men with hoods had busted their way into the Deutsche Bank right as they opened up their doors for the public. A bystander had witnessed the odd-looking men and called police around 8 a.m., and just as the two armed robbers exited the building, they noticed a cop car pulling up, which caused them to go back inside and get a couple of hostages. They fired off their weapons several times inside the bank, demanding a getaway car and ransom money. Negotiations spanned several hours, but the criminals were provided with not only an additional 6 figures of ransom money, but also received an Audi 100 around 9:45 a.m. Using the getaway car, the men picked up a woman named Marion, who was Hans's girlfriend. Then on the 17th, the group hijacked a public bus around 7 p.m. Again, there were about 30 people on board. Something you don't exactly see every day is that the criminals actually invited the gathering media crews to hold interviews while they held their hostages in hand. And what's really messed up is that some of these people conducting interviews actually provided photos of the officers ahead just so the robbers wouldn't get tricked if they had some sort of exchange plan drawn up. There were even a number of interviewers who gave beverages to the men in exchange for some words. One interviewer even asked Silke what it felt like to have a firearm pressed against her. During these interviews, Marion snuck off to use the bathroom and police were able to apprehend her. When Hans learned of this, he demanded an exchange. In return for Marion, he would allow a hostage to go free. However, for every 5 minutes that passed without a deal being agreed upon, he would take the life of a hostage. This led to the death of a 15-year-old boy who tried protecting his sister. Now, police actually did intend on returning Marion for one of the hostages, however, they fumbled by breaking their handcuff key, which led to them wasting what little time they had. It took over 20 minutes for medical help to arrive, and the boy would die just hours after being checked into the hospital. Hans and Dieter then made the decision to drive the bus away, which led to the death of a police officer who gave chase. The officer had collided with a truck. The bus finally crossed into the Netherlands around 2:30 a.m., and about 3 hours later, 5 hostages were released, 3 of which were children. Police demanded that the kids were let out or else they would not even entertain any further negotiations. Yet again, the criminals were given a getaway vehicle where they fled the scene with their 2 hostages. But around 2 p.m. on the 18th, a police cruiser rammed into it. This completely immobilized the vehicle, causing a gunfight to break out between the police and Hans and Dieter. One of the 2 hostages still being held was able to escape during the chaos, but Silke was not as lucky. She was struck in the heart by a bullet and ultimately died. As for Hans and Dieter, they were both arrested. This next entry revolves around a young woman named Kaylee Muthart. Kaylee was known as a high-achieving and diligent student that was even in the National Honor Society during her time in high school. However, at the age of 17, Kaylee left school. The reason being was a mixture of issues outside of school which caused her grades to diminish. These included her heart arrhythmia and working extensive hours at work in order to save up for a car. According to Kaylee, she believed that the best choice for her would be to take a break from class in order to salvage her academic record and still obtain a college scholarship. By the time Kaylee was 18, she had started to change. She began to consume alcohol and smoking marijuana. Kaylee shared that her family also had a history of becoming addicted to these types of substances, so she believed that she may be prone to it as well. Another detail that should be mentioned is that Kaylee is a Christian. One particular day when Kaylee was smoking, she stated that she felt abnormally closer to God. She was with a friend at the time and believed that the marijuana she consumed was laced with something harder. And not long after, Kaylee also lost her job. It's unclear if she was fired or had quit voluntarily. Her relationship with her boyfriend had also started falling apart. To deal with the stress, Kaylee ventured off into other substances, including Xanax. She was also diagnosed with bipolar disorder around this time. Kaylee was quoted saying, "It makes sense, since when I felt happy, I felt super happy, and when I felt down, I felt deeply depressed." Fast forward to August of the same year, Kaylee continued to battle depression and recalled that euphoric feeling she experienced back with the tampered joint. So she got the idea of obtaining that feeling again by finding out just what else had been mixed in. This led to Kaylee trying out meth. She was unable to sleep for several days and experienced disturbing hallucinations. For example, when she looked into the mirror, she shared that something looked odd with her face and blackheads started to appear. This caused her to pick at her face to the point where there was blood. After this incident, Kaylee continued to struggle with her mental health, but this time she was debating on whether or not she should try some other harder substances. Ultimately, Kaylee experimented with other stuff while still studying the Bible, which will play a key factor in her future hallucinations. Around November-December, Kaylee's circle of friends primarily consisted of addicts. Kaylee's family tried to help her and even get her to commit to rehab, but that never happened. She was also hopping around house to house, struggling with her substance abuse. Then on the night of February 5th, 2018, Kaylee took a significantly larger dose of and the next morning on the 6th, she stated that she began to hallucinate. After recalling fragments of that morning and comparing them to what onlookers had witnessed, Kaylee said that this is how she believed events unfolded. The friend that Kaylee was staying with at the time was not present on the morning of the 6th, so Kaylee thought that she had gone to church, so she walked along a train track that led to it. Despite being 10:30 a.m. at this point, Kaylee said everything looked dark. And it was in the darkness where she noticed a source of light with what looked like a white bird resting at the top of it. For whatever reason, this prompted Kaylee to think that she needed to offer up a sacrifice to the world. In her mind, this was a request from God. If she didn't sacrifice anything, everyone she knew would die. This sacrifice would end up being Kaylee's eyes, and she was totally convinced that this entire scenario was real. So she collapsed to her knees and cried out, "Why me?" And then Kaylee proceeded to remove her eyes. The actual details that she shared are way too graphic to be shared on YouTube, and she later stated that if no one helped her, she would have gone much further. Apparently, Kaylee wasn't too far from the church at this point, and a pastor actually saw her, so he rushed out and restrained her from causing any more damage. Kaylee was immediately rushed to the hospital, and what was left of her eyes were removed in order to prevent infection and salvage what was left of her optic nerves. She wouldn't wake up for 2 days, but when she did, Kaylee stated that everything was dark and she knew exactly why that was. Kaylee was officially blind. She said that she had plans to attend 90 Narcotics Anonymous meetings over the course of 90 days shortly after being discharged from the hospital. She was quoted saying, "It took losing my sight to get me back on the right path, but from the bottom of my heart, I'm so glad I'm here." Ursula Herrmann was described as a fun and kind little girl who lived in Bavaria, Germany. In her free time, she was often found practicing piano or doing gymnastics. Where Ursula lived, there was a stretch of forest that was frequented by hikers, bikers, and joggers alike. On September 15th, 1981, 10-year-old Ursula went on a bike trip back home from her cousin's place. And it's on this bike ride where Ursula would go missing. School had ended and Ursula had just finished her gymnastics lesson after class with her cousin. After hanging out at her cousin's house for a bit, Ursula headed back home. It was about 7:30 p.m. at this point. It wasn't so dark to where you couldn't see yet, but the night was well underway. Normally, this bike ride home wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. So after about half an hour after Ursula set out, her mother began to worry and called her sister, believing that Ursula hadn't left yet. To her shock, she was told that Ursula left nearly 30 minutes ago. This prompted Ursula's father to rush out in search of her. Even Ursula's uncle helped out in the search, but nobody could find any trace of the now missing girl. Police were contacted, and in no longer than an hour, large search teams consisting of police and firemen were out looking for Ursula. Hours would pass and no clues would be found. Hope was beginning to fade with everyone as rain started to pour, which made the dogs much less effective. However, just before midnight, Ursula's red bike was found, but still no sign of Ursula herself. The search continued the next day, and news of Ursula's disappearance started to spread fast. Radio shows informed the public of the missing girl, who stood at about 4 foot 7 inches tall with blonde hair, last seen wearing a gray woolen cardigan and reddish sandals. 2 days after Ursula disappeared, Ursula's parents received a phone call, but when they picked up, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, suddenly, a brief tune could be heard. They believed that this was a jingle played by a local radio station. The parents weren't exactly sure how to handle this situation. The calls definitely felt sinister, but it's not like they really revealed any information. What was the caller's intention in the first place? Could it be a hoax, or was it a legitimate call from the kidnapper? Similar calls were made to the Herrmann household that night, which led to police setting up equipment to record any future calls. Then, the very next day, the case would make a significant progression. A grim letter was delivered to Ursula's father. The letter consisted of words constructed from cutouts from various newspaper clippings. Being that this was in German, this was what the letter roughly translated to. "We kidnapped your daughter. If you ever want to see your daughter alive again, then pay the ransom," which was about 500,000 USD. And what's really interesting is that this letter was actually intended to be delivered a day earlier. It mentioned how the kidnappers would make a call to the family, and the parents needed to just say if they would or wouldn't pay the money. If they chose not to pay the ransom, or if they called police, Ursula would be killed. That same day, another call was made to the Herrmanns. Ursula's mother said that they would pay the money, but begged for some sort of proof that Ursula was still alive. However, the kidnappers didn't provide such proof. Another letter was delivered to the Herrmanns on the 21st of September, which provided instructions on how the ransom money would be delivered. The location wasn't revealed, but the culprits wanted Ursula's father to drive their yellow Fiat 600 by himself with the money. Now, the Herrmanns were a normal family that couldn't possibly pay such an egregious amount of money, so a member of the local community donated a portion of the ransom while the state provided the difference. The money was now in order. The family just needed the final instructions to carry out the exchange, but no new letters were received, nor were there any phone calls. In the meantime, investigators tried their hand once more in the forest to try and obtain some clues that might lead to the kidnapper. Over 100 people were part of this search party, and an additional 10 dogs were added. The search team was ready to invest several weeks worth of time into gathering clues, but it would only take 4 days for a major discovery to be made. On that 4th day of searching, rain was trickling down and the scene was gray. By this time, the vast majority of the forest had already been thoroughly combed through. Then someone yelled out for help. In a tucked away location of the forest, about 800 meters from the main path, an officer had hit something when digging in the dirt. Several other officers helped the man dig deeper, and they found a plank of wood that was wrapped in a blanket. The officers pulled this wooden panel out, which revealed another wooden board. This other one had several bolts fastened to it, which would allow the panel to slide off like a lid. It was approximately 2.5 feet by 2 feet. The lid was forced open, and to the horror of everyone there, they found Ursula inside. It said that several officers began to shed tears as they gazed at the deceased child. Ursula's parents were contacted and informed of the news. Her mother was at a loss for words, while her father continuously questioned if she had been hurt before her death. Medical officials determined that Ursula passed away anywhere between 1 and 5 hours before being left in the forest. The case gets a bit stranger though, as the box was about 4.6 feet deep. There was a seat inside that acted as a makeshift toilet, and there were also bottles of water, soda, candy, and other snacks inside. Furthermore, there was an assortment of about 20 books inside. By all intents and purposes, it seemed like the intent was to keep Ursula alive and entertained while she was buried underground. But if that were the case, how did she end up dying? There's actually a pretty simple answer. Ursula simply ran out of oxygen. Whoever designed the box included a ventilation system, but there was no device to actually allow for air to circulate. Investigators believe that whoever was responsible visited the forest to bring out Ursula, however, they discovered that she had died, which is why the Herrmanns never received any additional updates. Additionally, after seeing the box, police believed that there were actually 2 people involved in the crime, possibly even more. Investigators came to this conclusion due to the size of Ursula's box, not to mention it weighed over 100 pounds. They also think that it was a local or someone that frequented the area due to the location in the forest in which the box was buried. Over the years, numerous interesting suspects would arise, one of which was a man named Werner Masaryk. Werner was known by locals to be a quick-tempered man who was skilled with his hands. However, his fingerprint did not match the one that was found on the box. Other residents' fingerprints were also obtained, but it didn't belong to anybody. Despite this, police were still confident that Werner was their man. Sometime later, one of Werner's friends was questioned. His name was Klaus Pfaffinger. Klaus was a known alcoholic who was also an unemployed engineer. During his questioning, Klaus revealed that Werner asked him to dig a hole in the forest. Investigators immediately jumped in excitement, believing that they had just closed the case. But this feeling wouldn't last long. When asked to lead them to the location of the hole to see if Klaus was being truthful, he couldn't locate it. During the drive back to the station, Klaus admitted to lying. As for Werner, he was never found guilty of any involvement. Years would go by and nobody would be charged with the crime. However, in the late 2000s, the case would reignite an old spark. Werner Masaryk would find himself at the focal point of Ursula's disappearance once again. So Ursula's case was not considered a murder. Instead, it was regarded as a kidnapping with deadly consequences. And with this particular crime, there was a 30-year statute of limitations. So investigators were sort of rushing to find their culprit. State prosecutors looked back at past evidence and found the names of Werner and Klaus. It was 2007 and Klaus was dead, while Werner was still alive in Germany. After obtaining a new sample of Werner's saliva and testing it against new DNA evidence found on the box, the two were deemed not a match, but authorities still thought that Werner was the kidnapper. So they searched his home and found an old tape recorder. And this is about where a lot of people tend to believe that Werner was wrongly accused. You remember that jingle I mentioned that was placed in the phone calls to Ursula's parents? Well, a sound expert was brought in to compare the recordings on the tape recorder with the jingle heard in the phone calls, and they concluded that this exact device was used in Ursula's abduction. So Werner was arrested in May of 2008. In 2009, his trial commenced and he was quoted saying, "I know I was certainly not a good citizen, sometimes rude, and will see many attempts to portray me as a bad person, but I have nothing to do with this act." And it was true, Werner was not a good guy. Even his children said that he was terrible. On one occasion, Werner even took the family dog and locked it in the basement freezer where it ultimately died. His wife at the time actually divorced him because of this. Moments like this in Werner's life were brought up to further highlight that he was someone capable of kidnapping a child. When questioned as to why he locked up the dog, Werner said that he was punishing it by exiling it to Siberia. Ultimately, Werner was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And this case does have a lot of finer details which would keep us here for hours. But one final point I want to touch on is Michael Herrmann, Ursula's brother. He actually does not think Werner was responsible. Michael was present at the trials instead of his parents and thus was able to take in every little detail about the case and every piece of evidence. Another civil case was brought up against Werner by Michael in 2013, which was not actually focused around Ursula. Instead, the case was about Michael's tinnitus, which he claimed was caused by the extensive trials and criminal case of Werner. Michael was actually on Werner's side here. By initiating this case, Werner had an opportunity to prove his innocence, because Werner's defense was going to fight the case on the basis that he was wrongfully accused in the first place. But Werner would lose yet again in the end, and he had to pay a fee to Michael, meaning that the court was still convinced of the verdict from Werner's initial trial. Even then, Michael was adamant that Ursula did not get true justice, but he didn't pursue the matter any further. And there is one final piece of information I'd like to talk about for this case. In March of 2021, there was an anonymous letter made out to several media outlets in Germany. Whoever the sender was, they confessed to Ursula's kidnapping. According to them, they were in high school when they committed the crime, but nobody bothered to dig into the letter any further as the case had legally been closed by this point. This next entry is about a serial killer by the name of Robert Pickton, aka the Pig Farm Killer. He was convicted of taking the lives of 6 women in 2007, but he has admitted to killing 49 people in an interview. When law enforcement first conducted a search at Pickton's pig farm, their objective was to uncover illegal firearms. However, what they stumbled upon was far more disturbing. This prompted them to swiftly secure a second warrant for a more thorough investigation of the property. What they discovered was like something out of a horror movie. Scattered across the premises were human remains, with many of them found within the pigsties. Medical officials later determined that a significant amount of the remains belonged to indigenous women. Robert's father was rarely present during his childhood. Robert also had an older sister named Linda and a younger brother named David, all of whom were raised primarily by their mother, Louise. Louise was remembered as a gritty, hard-working woman who also ingrained that personality into her kids. The children often spent their entire days after school working on the farm, and as you could imagine, the children frequently carried a pungent odor around. This stench made Robert a prime target by other kids in school. Sometimes when bullies would chase him, Robert would actually hide inside the carcasses of animals on the farm, specifically pigs, to avoid being caught. At school, Robert also struggled to talk to girls, and whenever he did work up the courage to, he was always shot down and made fun of. In terms of grades, Robert also didn't see much success, leading him to drop out early on. The treatment he experienced by other children led to Robert retaining mental scars, and it didn't help that his parents weren't exactly the nurturing type. On one occasion, Robert's parents even slaughtered a calf that Robert deeply cared for and raised himself. Another moment that scarred Robert's early life occurred in October of 1967, and interestingly enough, this event didn't actually involve him. So, his brother Dave was out driving his father's truck when he accidentally rammed into a teenage boy named Tim Barrett. Dave panicked and rushed back home to get his mother, Louise. Together, the two returned to the site of the accident, and after inspecting the boy, Louise decided to move the body into this deep swamp area near the road. The very next day, Tim's body was found, and it was determined that he had drowned to death, and that the injuries from the car accident didn't actually kill him. Robert respected his mother greatly, and knowing of her actions sort of enabled Robert to do the same thing later in his life. His first victim was killed in the early 90s in Vancouver, British Columbia on a remote farm run by Robert himself and his brother. The brothers even started a charity organization and held parties and gatherings at their farm to promote it. However, these events were simply disguised as charities. They were actually degenerate parties that often included criminals and workers and frequently went up to several thousand people at a time. Initially, there wasn't much suspicion that something was happening on the farm, but in 1997, one of the workers at one of Robert's parties reported that he had attempted to murder her. The charge was ultimately dismissed, but this occurrence did make a few investigators uneasy. Fast forward to February of 2002, Robert's farm was raided by law enforcement after receiving a report that he had illegal firearms in his possession. Police weren't able to find any illegal weapons, but they did find items belonging to several missing women. This led to a deeper search of the property with the goal of finding human remains, and in the end, they obtained DNA from over 30 different women. Robert received 5 murder charges immediately, which increased to 26 in 2005. According to Robert, he would take his victims to a meat rendering plant and then feed the remains to his pigs. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His sentence included a 25-year prison term, which was the max sentence for his crimes. Robert was believed to have committed many more murders, but the judge did not allow for those charges to be included as they wouldn't be able to increase his sentence.